before I begin, I want to thank Masco Corporation and Martin Waymeyer Advocacy Communications for their general financial support of this series, and Mark Ridley's Comedy Castle, where we now are, for their help in making this event possible. I want to make you aware of another upcoming event, too. Fans of the Moth Radio Hour, Michigan Radio is welcoming the Moth main stage to Michigan this June for performances in Grand Rapids and Ann Arbor. The Moth is an organization dedicated to the art of storytelling, and the Moth main stage shows will feature 2 nights of wildly entertaining stories told live without notes by some of the best national and local storytellers. Think of them as politicians with charm. Tickets will go on sale this Monday. There's flyers around the room with more information. Now, today's topic, as I said, is how will the governor's budget affect you? We're going to discuss some of the sweeping reforms to Michigan's budget that the governor's proposed, but I want your questions too. So I'm going to start off with grilling our panelists a little bit. They include, on my right, John Bebo, who's executive director of the Center for Michigan, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan group formed originally by former publisher Phil Power to try to help lead Michigan out of our mess. And on my far right, not necessarily, is Ken Sikkema, who's a senior policy fellow at Public Sector Consultants, and also former Senate Republican Majority Leader. None of us, Republican was redundant, since none of us were alive the last time Democrats controlled the Senate. We're also waiting for Senator Burt Johnson, who's a Democrat who represents Detroit, Highland Park, and the Grosse Pointes. So we're going to start, though, before he gets here. And I want to start it now. Senator Sikkema is not part of the Snyder administration. He's not affiliated with it, although he sees things generally from a Republican perspective. And I'm curious to know, Senator Sikkema, do you think that the governor can find enough Republican votes to pass the pension tax? And if he can't, what happens?
Well, I think that a version of the pension tax is going to pass. So I really, I have to say that I've been involved in Lansing state government, I guess, in some way for 36 years, ever since I got out of college. I spent 20 years in the legislature. And if his budget proposal isn't changed in some way, it'd be the first time in those 36 years that a legislature didn't put their fingerprints on the budget in some fashion. But I do think that some version of the pension tax is likely to pass. Now, it's arguably the most controversial, from a Republican standpoint anyway, it's arguably the most controversial piece of his budget, and if Republicans can find an alternative to $900 million, then maybe they'll go for it. But I really, my crystal ball tells me that a version passes.
Now, the Republican senators have proposed only taxing pensions on people who aren't drawing them yet. Now, that would cause, however, that would blow a hole in the budget. In case you don't know, Michigan, unlike the federal government, has to balance its budget every year. So what would be the most likely scenario? Let's say they pass a form of the pension tax that provides significantly less revenue. How do you suppose the Republicans, who control everything now, would balance the budget?
I think they would rely on 2 things. Number one, I think they would decrease the business tax cut. And number 2, I think they would try to find some more spending cuts. But I think they would rely primarily on a decrease in Governor Snyder's proposal to cut business taxes by about 86%. So, you know, and I know that sounds a little strange that Republicans would do that, but I think Republicans in the legislature are looking at an 86% business tax cut, saying if there's a place for us to find some more revenue, then, you know, maybe it's a 70% business tax cut or a 60%, or you start with a 50% cut and you go to 75% in year 2 or year 3. So that's where I think they'd make up the difference.
Senator Johnson, welcome. Thanks for being here. Let me ask you a question. First of all, do you oppose the governor's proposed cuts of spending for education?
Absolutely, I do.
okay, are you opposed to the governor's pension tax?
I am.
Now, we've got, the last time I looked, a budget deficit in the state of $1.8 billion. How would you Democrats suggest they close this budget hole if they don't do those things?
Well, Jack, I think we got to put it in a little bit of perspective. And number one, I'm honored to be here. Thank you for having me. And Ken, you're reminding me why you were a very good choice for majority leader when you were there. I think the phase out of the MBT, if you will, meaning we don't do it all in one fell swoop. If we took a stab at it over the first year, maybe to the tune of half, maybe a little more in the second year, and the final in the third, I think would be more responsible. But frankly, we have a $1.4 billion budget deficit. What the governor is proposing is to add another 1.8 to it because he wants to give the large tax break to businesses, which I'm not opposed to, but it's got to be done in a more responsible manner. It's the reason why you've seen all these the folks protesting, and it's going to continue to be the reason why a number of his own Republican caucus members are against some of what's proposed.
Okay, but let's say for the sake of argument, we don't change the business tax. Your numbers are right. We still have a $1.4 billion deficit that has to be closed by September 30th or the state shuts down, right?
Right.
So how would you Democrats propose to close it?
I think there's some smart things that we could trim out of the budget, and frankly, I don't think it's all about cutting. I think some of the things we're going to have to do are going to have to be along the lines of investing. So while I'm not against what he's talked about with the MBT, we could start there. There's some money that could be pulled out of there. Frankly, there's some things that could be reworked as it relates to some of the credits that are used across this state. But to blanketly get rid of them all, I think, is, again, irresponsible. If there's money that we can trim and places that we can pull it from to put it back in the budget to make his budget a little more smart.
Let me add for clarification, in case any of you actually have a social life and don't spend your life as we do reading budget figures. Michigan, 4 years ago, inaugurated something called the Michigan business tax and then stuck a huge surcharge on it. Everybody hates this tax. Everybody, both parties. The governor is proposing replacing it with a corporate income tax on business that would raise much less revenue, only a little over a third the amount of revenue now, because the governor says our only hope as a state is to attract new business to the state, to new investment in a hurry to make up for the decline of the auto industry and other things. Anybody take issue with what I just said? So that's really where we are. Now I want to ask John Bevo a question. He's the mastermind of the Center for Michigan. And a lot of people, John, tell me, wait a minute. You're telling us we've got to make these huge cuts. We cut in what we're spending on programs like education, and at the same time increase taxes. Why didn't anybody see this coming?
Well, I think in some respects we're getting a little bit of what we voted for. I mean, all along, Rick Snyder said that he was going to cut business taxes. And he's sure trying to do that now. I think with some of the cuts, I'm not sure we're cutting in the place where people would like to see cuts. One area is the prison system. We spend more on prisons by several $100 million than we do on universities. For every dollar we spend on prisons, Minnesota spends 18 cents. There are audits left and right of that system alleging misspending. We've cut the population by 15% in the last several years, which was a management miracle from the last administration, and yet the budget still went up. We've got a lot of costs in that department with personnel that are out of line with other states, and there's a lot more that we could be done there. Some of this, as far as seeing it coming, Jack, groups like the Center and Citizens Research Council have been warning about these legacy costs of pensions and health care for several years now. The coming train wreck as we try to deal with those costs without hurting people who've worked a long time to get those benefits. The day of reckoning is here, and it shouldn't be a surprise because the information's been out there for a long time.
Well, Senator Sikkema, it's very fashionable to beat up on Governor Granholm now in her administration. I've done some of it myself. But the Snyder administration has said Michigan has been mismanaged and the people haven't been told the truth for the last 10 years. Part of which I think, were you still there? I mean, did Republicans as well as Democrats let Michigan down by not telling people really what the situation was?
Well, you know, it's always been fashionable to beat up governors, okay,
Right.
Whether Republican or Democrat. But The answer to your question is absolutely. I mean, I became Senate Majority Leader after the 2002 election. And the Michigan recession began in the spring of 2002. I mean, that's really when things started to go south. And I guess in defense of the early years of the Granholm administration and Republican and Democratic leaders in the legislature, in the first few years, we thought this thing was going to turn around quickly. We paid for very good economic advice from top-notch universities in the state, and they advised us that, hey, this thing's going to turn around, and this is not a long-term recession, but obviously it was. And over time, I think there's plenty of blame to go around that we didn't kind of push the reset button like Governor Snyder is trying to do. I give the gentleman a lot of credit for a very comprehensive proposal that, as I say, it kind of pushes the reset button. It said we got to get back on track. We got to get rid of this structural deficit, create a climate for business investment, and then we can move forward.
I'm going to ask one more question, then I want to start picking on you. Senator Johnson, there are a lot of people in Michigan, and including I think some of your constituents, who had good paying jobs, maybe assembly line jobs, and those jobs are gone now. And there's no real likelihood that they'll get new high paying jobs anywhere in the near future. What, if anything, can the legislature do for them?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Before I try to answer that, I do want to say one thing. I think the major reason that the state of Michigan has taken a huge step backwards when maybe some of the rest of the country has gone forward is we have been very, very much mired in our Republican-Democrat politics, and we've been very bad to each other. And I think the citizens of this state have recognized that. I mean, you look at the last governor, she cut a little over $4 billion out of the state budget, and that means she trimmed about an average of $500 million a year every year she was there. The issue here is that we've not invested where we needed to make smart investments, and the things that we've needed to do to create and keep and maintain a robust environment for business growth has not been on the radar screen because we've been too busy fighting. So when it comes to putting Michiganders back to work, I'm going to be very frank and honest with you. I don't think the legislature is in a position to create jobs, and I think that's a misnomer that people have been saying across the state for years. What I think can happen is that you can create a climate through top-level educational opportunities. I think you can create a creative climate like we've had with the film incentives, which was rooting a real industry in this state and was going to start really growing and being robust. I think you can do some very, very smart things like figure out how to connect Detroit to Chicago and other areas around this state and create a robust regional mass transit system. Kudos to my former colleague Marie Donegan, who's in the audience, who's a champion for that. But there are a number of things we just haven't done that would have created the environment. We still have an opportunity, and I am at least thankful for the discussions that I've had with the current governor, that he's going to be open to those things, understanding now that some of what he's thrown at the wall won't stick.